Thank you very much to all of you to have joined back the conference on time. Before to introduce the next speaker, Professor Dr. Gilbert Menier, I would like also to thank the medias and especially the Dhaka Tribune for being partner of this international conference. Now, we are moving to the heart of the very heart of the World War I with Professor Dr. Gilbert Menier, who has a long experience in teaching both in Algeria and in France and many other countries. He is a specialist of the history of Algeria and also of anti-colonial movements. He has taught in several secondary schools in France and Algeria. He was a lecturer at Constantine University and at the University of Nancy. He has published several books, reference books on Algeria, and as well as on the FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, the anti-colonial political movement in Algeria. Is going to give a presentation on Algerians and the First World War. Algerian people brought a major contribution to the war effort, the French war effort, which till now might not have been totally given its full dimension. And Professor Dr. Gilbert Menier is going to address both these contributions in terms of facts, but also the consequences of this contribution of Algerian people in the history of Algeria and also Franco-Algerian history and the colonial history as a whole. Professor Dr. Gilbert Menier, please.
Thank you. Excuse me for my horrible English. Algerians in the First World War. Of all the French colonies, Algeria represented the largest supply of material resources and manpower for France, along with West Africa. During the First World War, Algeria was asked to contribute more than any other country in what was called French North Africa. Over 5 years, the military stewardship sent its buying commission, which had a monopoly on buying products and which proceeded with requisitions. Grains, wine, tobacco, and sheep under advantageous conditions. In short, Algeria helped to feed France cheaply. Thus, in a country of limited labor power due to military conscription, with failing production, and that was struck by drought during the spring and the catastrophic harvest of 1917, which occurred precisely at the peak of the requisitions of food goods in 1917. J'ai pas compris. Oui, oui, je l'ai vu.
You have the figures referring to what Professor Gilbert Menier is telling on the screens.
Bon. So the catastrophic harvest of 1917, which occurred at the peak of the requisitions, and it was the first major famine occurred in the winter of 1916-1918 in the central eastern part of the country, east of Algiers, between Algiers and Tunisia. Only commercial products like tobacco and especially wine did well since the official prices were substantially augmented. despite the crisis of the maritime transportation, so that the congestion of barrels in the ports, especially in the ports of Marseille, of Rouen and Sète, the boom in tobacco and wine continued to mark the economic life, the colonial economic life of Algeria. Some timid attempts to construct industrial units in Algeria were undertaken in the context of the crisis of maritime relations that radically diminished the import of manufactured products. These very rare innovations ceased as soon as the exceptional circumstances of the war had disappeared. There was no question to peace would bring anything other than increased colonial dependence. Because of the demographic situation, the French Republic have instituted obligatory military service in Algeria in 1912. Most Algerians showed hostility, even while a small group of so-called young Algerians, also called évolués, that is to say, culturally, French culturally assimilated elites, they were favorable, because they saw the measure as a way of attempting to obtain political rights in exchange for the blue tax of the citizens. Many French officials made grand promises in this vein at the beginning of the war. In Algeria, curiously, there was no general hostile reaction visible, and the mobilization French officials, followed by the young Algerians, called or civilized individuals to black the path of barbarism, German barbarism, Teuton barbarism, in official discourse. With few exceptions, such as the very short revolt, 3-4 days no more, of Beni Chougran. Beni Chougran is in the northwest of Algeria, between Oran and the Shelif Valley, at about 400 kilometers from west of Algiers. The first departures of the conscripts occurred without serious difficulty for the colonial power. But the mothers and sisters of the recruits, of the young recruits, mourned and recited prayers for the dead. As a matter of prudence, the French had only called a fraction of the contingent to battle since 1912. Half of the Algerian standing army was composed of so-called volunteers engaged, at least theoretically. The decrees of September 1916 decide the total incorporation of those who were eligible for duty in 1917. Even if only half, three-quarters of the contingent was deployed to active duty, or else were affected to, for instance, auxiliary campaigns, the emotion in Algeria was very intense, especially in the east of the country, in the Constantinois. A large insurrection swept the north of the Jebel Awres. Awres is these big mountains which is found in the south of department of Constantine, not very far from Tunisia, in East Algeria. From October 1960 to the spring of 1917, the revolt was hardly repressed, especially by two divisions sent from Verdun, descend from the trenches. Nevertheless, the colonial power could mobilize about 175,000 soldiers for the French and recruit about 120,000 workers for the factories of national defense. This is why Algeria was considered so-called loyalist in official French discourse. But you know, I know that Algerians know that the Sheikh al-Islam of Istanbul had called in November 1914 Muslims to jihad. Algerians were sensitive to the propaganda from Berlin or Turkey, announcing the liberation of Muslims that were under the yoke of the infidels. Nevertheless, for the Algerians, engaging without hesitation under the Ottoman banner or in the German army was a step that most of them would not attempt. The millenarian exceptions of a Turking landing in 1914 has been disappointed. A lot of Algerians expected that Turkey will come in Algeria in 1914, and it was not true. So, in short, they were very disappointed, and the mass of Algerians took refuge in a prudent policy of wait and see, which was considered as a sign of loyalism by the official state French power. Other forms of so-called loyalism, the loyalism of those notables or agents of the administration, and also those assimilated to the French culture, so that évoluer, so that new Algerians or the Algerian primary school teachers, having been cast for such a long time as barbarians by French, finding themselves suddenly grouped with those who were civilized, could explain maybe such atypical attitudes. The war now. At the beginning of the war, the young recruits suffered in France a great deal. The war of movement of 1914 produced horrible carnage, frozen feet, tuberculosis, and so on. There were numerous moments of panics, desertions of the battlefield, or refusal to march, and a lot of summary executions. After the spring of 1915, Algerians were better taken in hand and instructed. Even if, of course, racism and discrimination never disappeared, they were increasingly praised along the French warfare, the regiments of Algerian infantrymen, which were called tirailleurs algériens, were among the most prized and the most decorated during the war in the French army, even, of course, if this sort of emphasis could not avoid to being a sort of seduction, native policy seduction at the same time. The Algerians were undoubtedly rather more or less integrated in the French army, because the French military order finally revealed itself to be rather less oppressive and less discriminatory than the colonial order. In the midst of butchery, one skin was equal to another. In addition, there was a favorable and sometimes enthusiastic welcome of French civilians for these exotic individuals who had come to help them in their country. There was also widespread for Algerians admiration for the nuns and nurses, the white sheets in the military hospitals, and the paternalist attention in general of the commandment. Indeed, all of this was not without effect. The operating spirit of solidarity, paternalism, solidarity, that occurred with the transposition of the clannish order, tribe order in Algeria with a regimental order, the colonel being a sort of caid for them, created a seductive image of a commander which uncontested authority for the Algerians. For them, the First World War was fundamental in that it offered 300,000 young men, workers and soldiers, a whiff of the winds coming from elsewhere for the first time. There had been less than about 15,000 Algerian workers in France in 1940. From 1940 to 1918, around 120,000 came to work in France, mostly for military purposes in a disciplined framework. The workers were administratively recruited, and they were often very young adolescents designated by the caid, by the chiefs of the official tribes, as so-called volunteers. The men became accustomed to the workers' life and the world of the factory, which is to say also to protest and to strikes. They could sometimes get to know and visit French men and women and their families. In any case, they assumed certain habits that were not very compatible with the maintenance of the former colonial order. A notable part of the future cadres of the so-called North African Star, which was the first nationalist Algerian party in 1976, were originally militants of trade unions, or originally some of them from the French Communist Party. Ultimately, France would both oppress and also, in a certain sense, liberate. The rules of factory life, military technology, and the image of military and industrial efficiency were made known to those who had been transplanted to France. For example, an infantryman from Sétif between Algiers and Constantine. His name was Mohamed Merdoud, presented to the court-martial in 1917 for having sent his mother an instruction book for automatic rifles, asking her to keep it carefully at home because it might be useful later for us. The price paid in blood for the Algerians were proportionally about the same as that paid other soldiers, even if I think that they were the soldiers that was often killed during assaults. It was to a subject pride for Clemenceau to have prescribed and obtained a rigorous equality between the war pensions for colonial and French troops. It disappeared later with General de Gaulle. Bon. In France, the image of the so-called Turcos, indigenous soldiers, was more or less positive. Their warlike and conscientious qualities were inscribed in the stereotype of the ultimate warrior. After the war, the image of the Algerian workers became solidly that of the ragged, disoriented subproletariat who was keen for French women and a dangerous carrier of tuberculosis and also smallpox. Even while integrated in the French army, of course, the Algerians did not lose their crucial sense of their Algerianness. But they were tempted by the possibility that the feelings and experiences that had witnessed in France might be transported in Algeria. As a result, after the war, for instance, the French schooling system, largely refused by the Algerians before the war, was largely accepted after the war, and a lot of Algerian families sent their children to school. But the French system had a very très faible, very weak number of seats, and most of them were refused. In any case, the overflow of promises from the time of war ran dry. Some small benign measures, such as the law of February 1919, called the Jonat Law — Jonat was the general governor of Algeria — wore down some of the harsher edges of colonial discrimination. There were distribution of tips, of gratuities, as for example, authorization for opening a Moorish coffee. But the grandiose promise of the rights of the citizen in exchange for obligatory military service was never seriously contemplated in Paris. Algerians were still relegated to the existence of a sort of category of half-citizens, semi-citizens, who were maybe able, some of them, for only at the lowest level of local elections, but not in the parliament in France. The statu quo was virtually maintained. In August 1920, la chambre bleue horizon, comment on peut traduire? The chamber blue horizon? No. Oriented to the right, the House renewed the discriminatory so-called native code, the Code de l'Indigénat, the application of which had been suspended in July 1914. The protesting accents of Emir Khaled — I wrote a book on Emir Khaled. He was the grandson of Emir Abdel Qadir, and once native captain in the French army, had seduced the Algerian masses and had propelled Emir Khaled to the front of the native political stage. In this context, the context of Bolshevism, of the strikes of 1990, we were very important in Algeria, among Algerians and also among French. It was the only time in the story of Algeria where you could find French and Algerians together. After, it was quite impossible. Though in this context of Bolshevism or strikes, the colonial power was given a fright. It stiffened quickly, closed the chapter of so-called native reforms, and managed to get rid of Emir Khaled in the summer of 1933. Go to Damas, where your grandson is enterré, is buried. Well, in conclusion, the frustrations were great. Conscious of having helped France in its hour of danger, the Algerians felt valorized. Between the two wars, the idea has taken hold that without American equipments on the side and the brave Algerian combatants of the other side, the French would never have won the war. The First World War unleashed the cycle of illusions and promises that were not kept. It strongly contributed to revealing Algeria to itself, raising the country to the age of maturation, and thus contemporary political decisions, and at last the inescapable liberation wave of 1954. The colonial system, blockage, and refusals carry their own logic. Thank you.
Non, je réponds tu peux parler de là-bas. C'était clair, oui. Merci.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Gilbert Menier. Thank you also, Professor Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed. As mentioned earlier, Professor Mushirul Hassan from India has not been able to join the conference due to some health problems. Well, thanks to these two first papers of this morning session, we got an idea, like the beginning of an answer, why this First World War is called the World War, because specialists of the Napoleonic Wars also depict those wars as the first instance of a war involving the world, with an estimated 3 to 7 million deaths. We could even mention the 7 years wars between 1756, 1763 as an instance of a war between European nations having a direct echo in their overseas empires in the making. So the difference between those wars and what is called the Great War or the First World War is not only a geographical one. The First World War was global. The recruitment of soldiers and their following deaths or injuries, the raw material and food supply, and the consecutive scarcity afflicted directly and durably colonies. Its effects were felt on borders, on the landscape and agriculture, on the economy and the laws, on the architecture, culture, ideas, affecting all the spectrum of humans' environment, life, and activities for decades to come till nowadays. Not only did it encompass most of the region of the planet, it encompassed also almost all the aspects of life. World War I was a global one at the human, the material level, but also the intangible one. It created a discourse. It was a matter of great debates and thinking in the colonies, as we said, as we heard from Professor Imtiaz Ahmed, where due to an instance where people from the colony took part in an unseen outbreak of violence caused by the colonial powers. It questioned the relation of colonies with the colonial power. And of course, also as Professor Imtiaz Ahmed mentioned, it was also instrumental in raising a new discourse on nationalism. It questioned also the legitimate authority of the colonial power on their colonies. So now we have around 40 minutes for question answers, which if you wish to, which you might wish to ask to Professor Imtiaz Ahmed and Professor Gilbert Menier. So maybe we can take first the questions, and then each scholar could answer to those questions. Please.
Me? Okay. I'm Professor Rebecca Huck from the Department of English, University of Dhaka. My question is addressed to Professor Menier. You mentioned the famine in 1917, the famine in Algeria. I think of the famine in Bengal after the Second World War. Now that is a traumatic event in the psyche of the Bengali people, the famine in Bengal. I would like you to tell me something more about the trauma suffered by the Algerians by this diversion of grain and other supplies to soldiers, as happened in Bengal by the British colonial power for their soldiers in North Africa and other places. What happened in Algeria to the people? Is there any literature dealing with the famine? Thank you.
Other questions? They will take all the questions which are relevant to their paper when you'll have finished all the questions. Thank you, Professor Hawk.
I am from Department of International Relations, fourth year. My question is to Professor Imtiaz Ahmed sir, that you're talking about Gandhi and Tagore, and I want to know the role of Gandhi during the First World War. That whether Gandhi is advocate for Indian national interest or freedom during the First World War, or what is the role of Gandhi to reduce the global effect of First World War? That what is the actual role of engaging? And the second question is Professor Gilbert, that during the First World War, around 25,000 people, Algerian people, are killed because of engagement in First World War. That why India was a colony of also British. That why the Indian soldiers were not used in First World War. Why Algerian? What is the difference between Indian colonial aspects during the 1941 and also Algerian colonial experience? That it is the political or any other difference that makes the engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Non, c'était pas pour toi. Oui, yes, please, Professor.
I'm Salahuddin Imam. I'm an amateur historian. Can somebody tell us, I think this question addressed to both professors, what was the actual battlefield performance of the colonial troops? You mentioned that there were some court-martials, but was it purely compulsion? Or what was the motivation really? Considering that they were not fighting for their own lands, they were in a foreign land, like a French soldier would fight for his hearth and home. So I'm just interested to know what kind of motivation was there, and was the performance in battle exceptional? Was it just, because considering that the First World War, there were, mass suicidal attacks all the time. And did they take part in those? And just to know a little more about the human aspect of this war. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Sir, Rana China, my question, I have two. One is for Professor Imtiaz, and that is, what was Tagore's specific take on I know that, he was against the whole concept of nationalism, but given the fact that there was a world war raging at that point in time, what was his view on India's participation in the war specifically? Did he have anything to say about that? And to Professor Gilbert, in France, I'm given to understand that just as in India, the colonial authorities had formulated a theory of race. So there was a martial race theory which said certain classes of people are suitable for becoming soldiers and others are not. My understanding is that there was something similar in the French colonial system as well, which spoke of the I think races guerriere and non-guerriere. Is that right? So if you could perhaps expand on that, and also taking on from what the gentleman just said, what was the kind of motivation that was provided to colonial soldiers? I know what the various aspects of motivation were for Indian soldiers and the Indian army, but I would be interested to know how the French dealt with that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Imtiaz. It's with regard to Gandhi's opinion during the First World War and the Second World War. As you mentioned, in the First World War, Gandhi was not opposed to Indian participation in the First World War or sending of Indian nationals to the war front. Whereas during the Second World War, he was opposed to Indian participation right from the beginning. The same Gandhi did oppose sending of Indian laborers to the West Indies for the sugar plantations. But at the same time, within the next 12 or 14 years, Gandhi changed his mind with regard to sending of Indian troops to the war front. And I have a question for Professor, the second speaker. I'm sorry that I can't pronounce his name properly. This relates to famine. The question raised by a professor of Dhaka University a few minutes earlier. It was not only after the Second World War that there was a famine in Bengal, or there was a famine in Algeria after the First World War. Whether famine has direct relationship with colonialism. After the war or Battle of Plassey in 1757, I'm sorry, there were successive famines in Bengal in the 1760s and 1770s, and huge number of people expired. Now my point is whether there is a direct relationship between colonialism and famine in the colonized countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are the speakers are going to answer to those different sets of questions first, and then if we have enough time, we will take more questions. I propose first Professor Imtiaz Ahmed, please, to answer the questions, and then Professor Menier will.
Okay. On the very first question, which also in fact goes to the question that the last speaker raised on Gandhi and World War I and World War II, why did Gandhi support, in fact, he raised an ambulance unit in World War I, and what made him to change, in World War II. Now, it's important to understand Gandhi's philosophy, and this is, and it has a longer civilizational roots in South Asia. You can bring Buddhism or Gautam Buddha here too. You win the enemy with gestures. You do not create, reproduce the enmity within the enemy. So you do certain things where the enemy would become helpless and would actually accept you. So this is how you win over the enemy. Because in World War I, when he tried to do that, and a lot of opposition was there, within Congress, that Bapu, this is the time we can, they are weak, we can do it. And he said, no. As I said, time and again he said, I'm not against, just throwing away the English people. That's not going to work. But far better would be, since they are now, it's not the Germans who are controlling us, it's the British who are occupying us. If we can show a good gesture, after the war, they will hand over independence. Now, when that did not happen, he had a statement which I think is absolutely, people uses it time and again. He said that the British gave us stone in place of bread. We gave them bread, they gave us stone actually in return. So the gesture was not return. And precisely from that experience, when World War II, he did not join, but he did not even, he did not go against, neither did he, join. He was kind, said, well, we are not going to disturb them now. And that's precisely the reason why Nehru was shocked when when Gandhi was arrested during the Second World War, and he was interned, because he said, this fellow saved the entire British Empire, why are you doing it? So the point is to understand Gandhi's core values, that I want to get rid of the enemy not by throwing a stone, not by attacking him, but by doing certain things where the enemy will give up, enemy will also transform. That is what I think is very important. Now, this is one. Second thing, and this is also time and again, if you read Gandhi seriously, you will find that the person has to be trained. There's a requirement to change the mind. You can't change the entire world in one day, in fact. So, it started in 1907, 1909, if you take that to be starting of his understanding of things. How do you train humans, in fact? And so his Hartal actually were the training grounds. And the training grounds, interestingly, that even if the police attack you, you are not going to attack the police. That requires a totally different kind. And that's precisely the reason why the British had no idea how to tackle this old man. Because if it is a violence, then it is easy. They are attacking with weapons, you attack. So the British had no problem in getting rid of the insurgents and all those revolutionaries and the terrorists. You give them a heavyweight. But with Gandhi, they had no other, they did not how to stop. Here is a fellow who is not using weapons, not even a stick. They are getting beaten up, and he's saying, you slap me in one cheek, you get in another, it is in the Bible, so you do that. That's a different kind of you can't replicate that. To some extent, I think people will say, well, Mandela did a little bit of that, and Martin Luther did a little bit of that, but it takes, repeating this kind of strategy probably requires a newer kind of thing. To some extent, Palestinians with the stone throwing, people will say they did a little bit of that. But look at the time when Gandhi did it, in fact. You attack me, I'm ready to get up, I'm ready to go to jail. To the point when the jails were filled up, the British thought this was ridiculous. Now, how he did it? Now, this has a even when he was South Asia. When he was arrested in South Asia by General Smarts, and when he was in prison, what did he do? This is interesting. He literally made sandals for General Smarts. And when he came out of the jail, he presented General Smarts the sandals. Well, General Smarts must have been shocked, in fact. Here is a prisoner giving you the sandal, but General Smarts kept that sandal actually. So when Gandhi became the Gandhi, General Smarts returned that sandals actually, saying that, and I understand it's now in the museum. So here is a person who is imprisoned but is ready to win over the enemy by making sandals for him. That requires a different kind of strategies altogether, and I think Gandhi at the end probably would say that he failed because Nathuram Godse got him, but it remains to be very important. There are whole Arab Spring, when the Arab Spring was being discussed, a lot of people referred to Gandhi again. So, you can't throw him out, even our Shahbag, What do you do with non-violent movement of that kind who are ready to be, thrown in prison and everything, but will not say anything? How you win over the enemy? And I think that was the fundamental thing that he tried to practice in World War I. By the time of World War II, it was not there. So he said, I'm not going to support, neither I'm going to attack you, I will wait. On the battlefield performance, I think my friend probably would be able to say more on this. I don't think you will find an universal kind of thing that all went perfectly, all were heroes. Like any war, I believe even during the colonial times, all the participation, you had different scenarios also. Some were really heroes, some got decorated, some regiments really played well, some individuals did not. Some even wrote songs. Nazrul Islam actually ended up writing more creative songs during that time than actually fighting the war. So, I think you will not get a universal kind of understanding on the performance. On the third, on India's participation in the war and what did what did Tagore had to say about that. Now, Tagore, first and foremost was against all war. But when he went in 1916, 1917 to USA and Japan, he was trying to tell the audience, don't join this war. This is a war on nationalism. This is not going to create you. This is a demon that has got into your head, and you need to get out of that mindset. You need to get out of this nationalism, and almost, which E.P. Thompson later on says, that Gandhi was a post-national thinker long before post-nationalism, and this post-modernity became a fashion. So E.P. Thompson actually writes the word post-modern when writing the introduction years back on Gandhi's nationalism. And it's an interesting introduction, because here is E.P. Thompson, coming out of the working class kind of a discourse, trying to tell that Tagore was, much more what you call became postmodern long before postmodernity became a fashion. Now, I think one element that he did during the wartime was education. He literally got himself absolutely passionately involved with Shanti Niketan to create this education. And this is a fascinating kind of a experiment. How do you teach young people to have a mind which is creative, which is non-violent, which is musically, gastronomically, with nature, with environment, with women, all this together. If you look at Shanti Niketan discourse, that was the discourse he created doing. So his response to the war was by showing examples. One was critiquing nation and nationalism, almost telling you that you are going to have another war. And he was right when Second World War came. Well, he did not live to see the whole of it, in fact, but at least he could sense where things were going. So from that point of view, to give a very short answer to that, I think he was trying to show more what can be done to get out of it, rather than making a statement that like Gandhi, supporting or not supporting. I guess I answered everything. I just want to say one or two on the famine and the state, and this I think we can't throw away Amartya Sen, given that he has worked so much on the Bengal famine and particularly Bangladesh and thing. You see, the state has to be brought in, the colonial state, and it can be authoritarian state, because two things Amartya Sen makes it very clear. One, democracies can never have famines. This is interesting. And second, which is linked to it, and why democracy cannot have, because you are not gagging the information. The information goes out, the media plays, the civil society plays, so you can't, the thought process can't be controlled, neither can a famine be controlled. So one, democracies do not have famine. And the second one, which is important, for which I think he got the Nobel Prize, and that is entitlement. Famine takes place because of lack of entitlement. Now, lack of entitlement is understandable. When you have a war kind of a situation, you don't have any employment. There's no, nothing for the person. The pocket gets emptier and emptier. So where will you, get food to purchase? In fact, there are research which has shown during famine, sometimes in near around areas, there have been food actually, but people could not purchase. That is the process. And this whole entitlement discourse that Amartya Sen brings is important, and I believe it will not differ whether in Algeria or in Africa or in South Asia in that context. But I'm sure my friend probably will be able to say more on this. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. And now Professor Gilbert Menier is going to answer the question related to his book.
Well, I hope I understood, I could understand the questions. I'm not very sure to have all understood. On the point of view of famines, in the First World War, the effects, the consequences of famines were very contradictory. You know that all in history, nothing is unilateral, all is dialectical. The famine of 1917 coincided with general conscription established in Algeria, who provoked the insurrection of the southeast Constantinois, but she provoked also because people were very hungry. It provoked an increasingly of engaged men in the French army. So results very contradictory. But 5 years later, one of the arguments of the first nationalism was the colonialism provokes in our country famines and impedes people to eat normally. I say yes, that in 1920 there was another second famine much more important of the first one in 17. Three or four more victims. But I just want to say that there are a large panel of famines in a country like Algeria. That I can call the famine of old style. The harvest is very bad, and peasants cannot eat because there is no grain. There is nothing to eat. Well, it's a thing which was very known around Mediterranean countries. In my southern France, I remember what told my grandmother. It was not very different. And there is another style, another form of famine. It's the link between the harvest first and also the commercial links in Mediterranean relations between the north and the south, especially between the state power of Algiers et Chambre de commerce. Train Chambre de commerce. A trade chamber of Marseille. Because trade chamber of Marseille in the 18th century, for instance, asked every year, I want this quantity of grain. And the state of Algiers, before the colonial period, said, okay, you will have your time. But even if there was a harvest, a catastrophic harvest, and if they could not buy the grain to peasants, they sent what is called in Arabic mehala, but I cannot translate it in French, expedition, military expedition to requisition the grain, so that peasants after the mehala have no grain. In 1995, at the beginning of the 19th century, there was a horrible famine. The Chamber of Commerce, Trading Commerce of Marseille was the same quantity, maybe higher. So that the state power of Algiers sent a lot of mehala in the whole country to sell the grain. And people were angry. In 1905. 1805. 1805. Oh, sorry. And Algiers was surrounded by more than 100 of people. We have nothing to eat, so that the day the chief of the state wanted to administrate, what can we do? The result, we shall send in the city des porte-voix, des loudspeakers, say the Jews are responsible. And during 3 days, the Jews are responsible, the Jews are responsible. And after 3 days, the population, the Muslim populations of Algeria surrounded and killed about, the best Algerian historian said, in an afternoon between 1,500 and 800 Jews. Because 1 or 2 Jews were commercial intermediary between the trading commerce of Marseille and the state power. So it's very difficult to understand what is really a famine. The most important famine in the 19th century was this of 1868 under the Second Empire in Napoleon, because there is a relationships, commercial relationships, and also a lot of earth, a lot of earth which has been taken to the Algerians and given to big capitalists such as lot of lands to, for instance, La Compagnie Genevoise, the Swiss, and so on. But the famine, they don't disappear completely, but between the 2 world wars, there is no important famine like the others. It can be explained, but I have no time. For the importance, I can tell you some numbers. The famine of 1917 provoked between 8,000 and 10,000 dead. That population of Algeria at this time was about 8 millions, about between 7 and 8 million. This of 1920 caused between 20 and 25,000 deaths, with about the same population. So I cannot compare this famine with those you were taking off for Bengal from India, because I don't know exactly the proportionally relations between these numbers. It's you to tell me or to imagine what it can be. Wow. Qu'est-ce qu'il y avait d'autre encore? There was a question, the motivation of the Algerian soldiers. Why the Algerian soldiers went into the French army without, I tell you, without great difficulty. I thought I answered to this question, but I try to precise it now. The reason was, there was in Algeria several communities, but especially 2 communities. The French, the European, about 800,000 in the First World, at the beginning of the First World War, and 7-8 millions of Algerians. And a lot of Algerians wanted equality. What was thinking the so-called young Algerians, emancipated Algerians, culturally assimilated Algerians, and what they tell to people, especially in the cities, but not only in the city. People like Farhat Abbas, who was the first president of the GPRA, I knew him, I got a lot of time with him. They told them, if you are a citizen, l'impôt du sang, comment on dit ça? The blood tax of military, compulsory military service, it is a condition to be an actual citizen. So you must go to French army, and the promises of the French power is that you will become one day a real citizen, equal for between French and Algerians. And I think it's the most important reason, more or less consciously, why people, young people, went to the war without without important problem. In fact, I tried to tell you, there was, of course, racism, discrimination a long time, even in the army. But in the army, there was a lot of young officers. They're often, they were Catholics, but Jean Lyotet, like Marshal Lyotet, that if you consider these Algerian soldiers like you consider French soldiers, they will be French, and we shall have no problem with that. The problem is what there was colonial system, and colonial system cannot imagine, especially the French of Algeria, that equality was possible. I told you that a lot of Algerians sent their children in French school after the wars, and before they would not send them. But it's exactly the contrary between before and after the war. But the colonial system in 1914, 5% of Algerian children were scholarized in French school. In 1939, about 9%. In 1954, the beginning of the war liberation, Algerian war liberation, less than 15%. So quite nothing. I spoke with, for instance, with Farhat Abbas, Mohammed Ben Jelloul, or other people of this time. In my village, said me Farhat Abbas, there were only one school with 30 pupils, and in 1 year, the teacher refused more than 200 children. I think you can understand. We want equality. We have nous avons combattu. We fought for equality, and the colonial system remains the same. So it's not. We cannot continue like this, so that we must have to liberate by ourselves. I told you it's in 1956 that the first Algerian national movement was founded, but it was founded where? In a town, the name of which is Paris. By Algerians, we were workers in France. They taught how to fight on the social point of view, but also the political point of view, in the French factories, in the French social context. Bon. I don't know if you know that, until the Second World War, no Algerian political movement was founded in Algeria. All were founded in France. It's only after the Second World War that you have the first one MPLD movement, which is founded in Algeria. Bon. I tried to I don't know if I said exactly what you wanted. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor Imtiaz Ahmed and Professor Gilbert Menier, for your insightful papers and answers to the questions.
Excuse my English.
That's
Please.
The end of the first half of the session dedicated to the impact of the Great World War on the colonies. We are going to meet again, I propose, more by 2 p.m. than 2:20, since there'll be 4 papers in the afternoon session, which will be chaired by Squadron Leader Anna China. So you are all welcome to come back by 2 p.m. Thank you very much.